Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Hawk, and I'm the Executive Director of Neighbor to Neighbor. Valerie will be with us next week. We want to welcome you to the Neighborhood Passions Affinity Network. The purpose of this network is to bring together neighbors, community partners, and other stakeholders from all across the metropolitan area around 8 key neighborhood passions: crime prevention and reduction, beautification in the environment, neighborhood planning and development, making government work for our neighborhoods, neighborhood preservation, community and diversity, caring for our neighbors, and effective neighborhood organizing. Tonight, we're focused on the fourth passion, making government work for our neighborhoods. Our topic is getting out the vote, how residents and neighborhood groups can make a positive difference. Before we start, we'd like to take a moment to get to know who's with us tonight. What I'd like you to do is to share with us your name and your neighborhood, and if possible, how long you've lived in that neighborhood. This is an invitational experience, so you are invited to share, but you're not obligated to share. I've gone ahead and put the questions in the chat room in case you're like me and forget halfway through. So you can refer to those there. But again, we're going to ask you to share your name, the neighborhood you live in, and how long you've lived there. I'll start, and I'll pick someone, and then whoever I pick gets to pick the next person. We'll just go around the room that way. My name is Jim Hawk. I live over in historic Edgefield, which is in East Nashville. I've lived in that neighborhood for 18 years. I'm going to go immediately to beneath me, where I see Van Pinnock sitting in the center square, and ask him if he'll introduce himself.
Sure. I'm Van Pinnock. I live in the College Hill neighborhood, which is right next door to Tennessee State, and we've been here 16 years. All right, so I will, let's see, Madeline looks interesting. Madeline? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Thank you. I'm Madeline Garr. I live in Donaldson. I am a native Nashvilleian and grew up in West Nashville. And then we've been in Donaldson for 45 years, something like that. So let me see. I want Ike. It's your turn.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ike Balele. I am from Inglewood neighborhood, and I've been there for about 3 years.
Ike, who are you going to pick?
Any person eager to share, I guess. Right now, that looks like Kate.
Thank you, Ike. I'm Kate Monahan, and I also live in the College Hill neighborhood, and we're part of Hadley Park in North Nashville, and I have been there for 7 years. All right, let's see. Jessica.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica Lee. I am currently in Stone Mountain, Georgia. I moved back to Georgia probably about, going on 3 years now. However, when I was in Nashville, I lived in the Antioch area, and I was there for 10 years. And I will pass it on to, Trish.
Thank you, Jessica. I missed you. Hey,
I
this is
missed you
Trish
too.
France. Trish France. I live in Caldwell Abbey Hall, and I think we've been here about 13 years. I also work for Neighbor to Neighbor. And I will pass it to Dawn.
Hello. I also live in historic Edgefield, and I have been here for 3 years, 3 years. Moved here in 2018 from Washington, D.C. So this is my first Nashville neighborhood. And let's see, Mattia, I'll pass it to you.
Hi, I am Mattia Powell. I don't know that our neighborhood has a name. I believe we tried to brand it Curry Acres, but I'm not sure if that really stuck. But I live on the same street with Seven Oaks Park, so close to Woodbine, but in Glen Cliff area. And I've been here for about 5 years now. So very excited about my little neighborhood. I'm gonna pass it, and I'm pretty sure I hope that I don't mispronounce this. Is it Huesi?
Wacy.
Okay.
My name is Wacy Zano. I'm in the Eastwood neighborhood in East Nashville. I've been here for about 10 years. And Aurelia Dooley, please.
You're on mute, Aurelia.
Did she hear me?
Yeah.
Aurelia.
Your mute button is in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. If you can click that, there you go.
All right. My name is Aurelia Dooley. I live in the College Hill neighborhood. I have lived in this particular community all of my life. Currently, where I live, I've been living here for 57 years.
And for those of you who are new, Aurelia was the 2019 finalist for the True Neighbor Award. And so quite a community leader. So good to have you on board tonight.
Thank you, sir.
So tonight's topic is getting out to vote, how residents and neighborhood groups can make a positive difference. Tonight we'll be discussing why your help is needed, what you can do as an individual and as a neighborhood group, and how to do it in a nonpartisan way. Joining us this evening are three great resources. Dawn Schluckbier from Think Tennessee, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank dedicated to promoting pragmatic public policy solutions that help drive our state forward. Madeline Gar from the League of Women Voters Nashville, a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization that encourages informed and active participation in government and to influence public policy through education and advocacy. And Mattia Powell from Civic Tennessee, a nonprofit civic engagement coalition that envisions a future where underrepresented communities of color, single women, and young people, the rising American electorate, have a greater voice and influence in shaping state policy and choosing leaders who affect their lives. We're very pleased to have the three of you join us tonight for this topic. I would like to start with Dawn. Dawn, why do we need to be concerned about getting out the vote? I mean, we were talking earlier privately, and there seems to be lines around the polls this year. Why should we be concerned about this?
Awesome. Thanks, Jim, and thanks for having me. It's good to meet everyone. I think I can sort of set the sort of foundation for this conversation, which is to answer Jim's question about sort of why should we be concerned and why should we be excited and motivated to help get out the vote. And then I think Madeline and Mattia can really talk sort of on the groundwork, literally what can you do? What can we do in our individual capacity and as an organization? So I'm going to share a couple of graphics while I speak. Can you just confirm that you can see my slides? This is working? Perfect, thank you. So Think Tennessee, like Jim mentioned, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit research and advocacy think tank. And we're focused, our organizational vision is a state where all Tennesseans are civically engaged and economically secure. So civic engagement is a core part of what we do and what we work on as an organization. And the way that we sort of approach that, or how we look at that, is looking for evidence-based solutions that can help impact civic engagement and economic security, which is to say that we're not fully and solely a civic engagement organization, but those are the two pieces that we've sort of narrowed down as the best way to start sort of this approach of moving our state forward and strengthening the voice of voters. So we look to other states to learn from examples to see what other policies other states are using that might work here. If there's a policy question that we're trying to answer, we'll try and sort of look to evidence-based solutions to help us tell that story. So with civic engagement, there we go. Why is it important, or why should we care? I think this is the answer that I always point to. When you look at those two key measures of civic engagement, voter registration and voter turnout, Tennessee traditionally, historically, regularly trails most other states when it comes to both of those indicators. So if you're looking at all 50 states and DC, so 1 through 51, with 1 being the highest ranking for for voter registration or voter turnout. In the last presidential election, Tennessee ranked 45th in voter registration and 49th in voter turnout. So only 2 states had a smaller proportion of their estimated eligible voters turn out than we did, and those were West Virginia and Hawaii. So 2018, sort of a mixed picture, slightly better, slightly worse. These numbers just came out recently. We moved back in voter registration a little bit to 48th and up a little bit in midterm turnout. And that was one of our most competitive elections in a while, and still comparatively, we were ranked 44th out of the turnout across the country. So that was kind of the motivating factor that got us started on this path as to something to focus on and figure out why is civic engagement such a challenge here in Tennessee, and what might we be able to do about it. One thing that we do sort of another way that we like to think about participation and what that means, we looked at some census data recently, and these are estimates both of, this is self-reported racial data and voter participation data. So this is an estimate, but we took a look at the average sort of percent of the population that white and Black Tennesseans make up over the years from 2008 to 2018. And that's that sort of circle graph to the right. So you can see that the average across those 10 years was 79.2% white and 15.9% Black. But then we also looked at average voter turnout over those same years. And even though the percentage of the actual eligible voters, percentage of Tennesseans, this is so hard for me to articulate all the time. Black Tennesseans make up almost 16% of the of eligible voters in Tennessee, but their average representation within the voter turnout population was less than 15. It was about 14%. And the opposite is true for white Tennesseans. So they make up about 79.2% of the population, but in terms of turnout, they're representing about 81% of the voter turnout. So they're essentially slightly overrepresented, and Black Tennesseans are slightly underrepresented, which is all to say that there is sort of an unmet capacity, so that efforts to get out the vote and to educate about voter registration and to help folks kind of maneuver the process, particularly those who may have a felony conviction. There's a numerous step process that needs to be completed in order to get those voting rights back. And so efforts by groups like the League of Women Voters and Civic TN and neighborhood associations and everyone like yourselves to take part in all of those pieces is really important, and I think key to moving that needle. And then I just have a couple of slides here to talk about one of the ways that our state differs from other states, and this is sort of representative of one of the ways that we as Think Tennessee kind of think about civic engagement and civic engagement policy. So probably not news to anyone. I feel like there's been a lot of talk about absentee voting and absentee policy the last couple months. But the gray states on this map here, Tennessee is one of 16 states who in a normal year, traditionally, you're required to submit a request for an absentee ballot, and you have to provide an excuse. So something like you're going to be out of town. In Tennessee, if you're 60 or older, you can normally vote absentee in any election. You just have to request that application. You can be sick, you can be on jury duty, like there's a list of excuses. The dark yellow states, any registered voter who wants to apply for an absentee ballot can. You don't have to provide a reason. And then in the light yellow states, there's 5 of them, including Hawaii there at the bottom, that do what's called vote by mail, which is where they mail directly an absentee ballot to every registered voter. So they sort of bypass that application process, and every registered voter will get a ballot. If they want to use it, they can use it. If they don't, they can go in person. So those are the sort of 3 different approaches that states take to this idea of absentee voting. And this was, at the beginning of the year, pre the coronavirus pandemic. During the coronavirus pandemic, states sort of reacted a little bit differently. This sort of just the graphic is all I really want to point to. So those boxes represent the 16 states that I mentioned with gray states in the previous image, where you're required to submit an excuse to vote absentee. So earlier this year, 12 of those states decided to consider the coronavirus pandemic a valid excuse, so that any voter who was concerned about the pandemic, about the virus, could request an absentee ballot and vote from home. Tennessee was one of the 4 states who chose not to do something like that. Through the legislature, there were eventually absentee eligibility did expand as a result of some legal actions. And so this is just meant to represent what our policymakers had chosen to do. And then I'll just wrap up with one more example, just because I mentioned that. This is now an updated just sort of status of what those 16 states have done for this November election. So it just looks a little bit different, where there's still 4 states who've chosen not to consider the coronavirus in terms of absentee eligibility. But Tennessee is now one of 2 states, along with Missouri, who are allowing voters and caretakers of voters who have underlying conditions and are concerned about the pandemic to vote absentee. So there was a little bit of a change. And I just share that just to sort of demonstrate, you know, as we think about civic engagement and the policies that impact civic engagement, we like to look to other states like this to sort of compare and see what we can maybe learn from them and see what might work here. So we're focused more at that sort of policy level and what ideas we can kind of steal from other states. But I'll leave it there and let these experts talk about what we can do sort of individually to get out the vote.
Yeah. And let's turn over. Madeline is with the League of Women Voters of Nashville, which has had a long and glorious history here in Nashville. Would you start us off by talking to us about what your organization does and what we can do as individuals and as neighborhood organizations to help get out the vote?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me. It is true that League of Women Voters has a long history. Sometimes it's not as glorious as we would have liked it to be looking back, but we've learned. And it's important to realize that the League has a major goal, and it's about registering and educating the voting voters. That is their primary goal and has been for years. So what we have been engaging in predominantly is since June, even though we're in a pandemic, we've had in-person voter registration. We have worked with our partners to encourage and get good information, and it was often changing information regarding absentee voting, and lately the first-time voting change that we partnered with people trying to get the lawsuit in front of the judge to make it available that first-time voters do not have to vote in person in this election, which was always of concern. We also monitor issues around suppression of a vote, and there have been many in Tennessee, unfortunately, in the last 20 years that have and things have gotten worse, and therefore I think may explain, Dawn, some of your numbers regarding the disproportionate share of who's voting and why, but that's a long history. Our major message right now that we use through both social media and print, and we are distributing information to places like 50 Forward and food banks and the community centers, is to do with 3 basic things. Mail early if you're going to get an absentee ballot, vote early, and have a plan, because anything can happen on any given day, and that we know that in 2020 probably better than we've ever known it before. And as far as getting out the vote, you know, I'm very excited that Tennessee registered 4.4 million more voters. This is just in this next election. That's wonderful. But if they don't go and vote, what's the point? Registering is not enough. So how do we get the word out? And I love the concept of the neighborhood, and I love the concept of creating relational voting. That is, you work with your family and your friends and your people that are in your vicinity and at your work to try to help them understand why it is so important to vote, because person by person has much more influence than some general tweet or how can I say it, Facebook post or Instagram picture. It's very important. So we are trying to have tell 5 people, and you can tell 5 people and then ask them to tell 5 people to get them to vote. Just building what we used to call the pyramid scheme, this is that kind of concept. Or text 5 people, if especially young people seem to respond to text. I have 2 daughters, and first it was letters, and then it was email, and then it was text, and some that you as a parent have to kind of learn how to communicate with your kids when they're not in front of your face all the time. So we think that that is a really important thing. I wish there was a magic bullet. I firmly believe that it is a privilege to vote, but it's also an obligation. It's not just something that I might do. It's not really a choice in many countries, whether you vote or not. In many countries, it is a rule. It is a law. I taught international students for years and had students who had to go back to their embassy here in the United States or show up in their country and have to leave their studies because it was a law to vote, and not voting there was a penalty involved. We have the choice, but we also have the burden of obligation. And I don't think our civics, what is or may not even be taught anymore, emphasizes that enough. So we've got to start where we are and re-educate people that this is, yes, it's a choice. Even when you don't think you may have a choice, you still should make a choice and get in there and be part of the solution instead of sitting out and be an observer. This week, we've actually established a voter information hotline. And this hotline is to help voters who may be at the polls or maybe have questions before they go to the polls, so that they can call this hotline and somebody will answer them. If not immediately, they'll get a call back in 24 hours. And there's also another line run by a community called voterprotection.org, or Protect the Vote, I think it's what it's called. And this is if you encounter suppression or harassment at the polls while you're there, you can call this number and talk to a lawyer who will give you advice about what can be done and what your rights are. And I hope that doesn't happen in Tennessee. I think Davidson County Election Commission has done a very good, transparent job. What we've observed in our discussions with them and our observations of the commission have been very positive. They've created a safe environment at the voting place, but you never can tell what will happen. So I think it's important to have a place to go to get good information. One thing that we need to also tell our neighbors is if they do, there was an incident last week, I think it was in Virginia, where people of different persuasions were causing problems at the voters who had gone to vote. And that, what do you do if that happens? What if you feel threatened? What if you're feeling intimidated when you go to vote? You should go and get the poll worker and report it to him or her. And that is their job, to make sure that the voting precinct is safe for everyone. No one, regardless of who it is, should ever interfere with the vote in any way, such form. and be assured that the poll workers that you see when you go in that are working there, they have gone through huge hours of training to do their job. And if there are poll watchers, you will know them because and I've been one, you'll be sitting in a corner somewhere with a badge on and your mouth shut. So you have to be credentialed to be a poll watcher. You cannot talk to anybody, and your only communication there is with the poll worker who is in charge of the entire precinct. So I think that those kinds of messages need to go out to our communities because there's a lot going on in the, I don't know what you call it, the virtual outer space of talking that is not true about what happens in Tennessee. And so that is there. I will put the numbers in the chat box so that you can see them. And in that way, you don't have to listen to my Southern voice talking. And I'll turn it over to Mattia.
Thank you guys so much. There's so much that's been said, so I don't want to duplicate, but really great work happening with the League of Women Voters, and also thank Tien. And I have been fortunate enough to be able to work with them, with the League on voter protection, and would think on so many things. So it's great to be here with you all again tonight. Civic Tennessee is a relatively new organization, and Dawn showed some slides that kind of keyed up my talk quite nicely. And we were organized and founded to really make sure that underrepresented communities had a voice in the election. And so, and in the choices that the elected leaders that represent their communities. And so our focus is really on that rise in American electorate. So we define that as Black voters, Hispanic voters, young voters, and then single women voters as well. And our goal is to really make sure these voices that have been historically underrepresented are represented in the democracy. So how we do that is we work with nonprofit organizations and help them, equip them to do civic engagement work. There's tons of nonprofits that do advocacy work already around healthcare, around homelessness, around food insecurities. So they're already doing this work around, working to pass, specific legislation or influence policy. But many nonprofits are not in doing civic engagement work. It does take a specific skill set to do that. It takes specific data. It takes specific knowledge. And honestly, it takes a lot more capacity to do that. And so what Civic Tennessee wants to do is bring nonprofit organizations together, have shared visions and goals, and provide resources so that they will have those resources to do this work. So we have about 21 organizations that are a part of our coalition that have committed to doing civic engagement work. Some of these organizations are ones that you already know that have been doing civic engagement work for a long time. Some of these groups are newer and really want to enhance what they do civic engagement wise. So we've been working with them to host phone banks, to think about how they want to reach out to their constituencies through text and phone banks. Madeline mentioned, relational organizing, which is actually a strategy and has some technology tools around how to do that if you want to do that in a more formal way. And so we've been working with our partners to do relational organizing using an app. So a lot of the work that we've been doing is really grassroots level work. And making sure that our partners have the resources to do that. When it comes to your neighborhoods, though, Madeline is extremely correct. You guys are in contact with so many folks in your communities. It is so easy for you to, go outside and talk to a neighbor. So, the one thing that everyone can do is convince their neighbors and their friends and their family and their network to vote. You don't have to have a fancy app like we have to do that. You can do that on your own by just calling or texting or, talking across the yard to your neighbor and making sure that they have a plan to vote. If you are interested in doing any type of election work, like if you want to make phone calls or if you want to text, I will put the link to some events that we're hosting with our partner organizations. We're doing some, phone banks that we have that you can actually do on your own time. So the good thing about, being, in a environment where we can't go out and do door-to-door work like we normally do is that we do have a lot of virtual options. And many of these virtual options can be done from the comfort of your own home and on your own time. So we're not planning events as much as possible like we used to, where you had to come somewhere to do something. Now you can just log onto your phone or your computer whenever you feel you have time to do it, and you can make some calls or you can text some folks. So I'll put a link in the chat that has some signups we're hosting. So we have options to virtual phone bank, and we have specific communities. So we are a statewide organization, so we're not just focused in Nashville, but we're doing statewide work. So we have opportunities to reach out to folks in West Tennessee and East Tennessee, as well as Middle Tennessee. And so, I will put that in the chat. So, I think as much as you can do to convince your friends and family to vote, or if you want to convince a stranger to get out to vote by participating in one of these activities, I think we're at a place where it's all hands on deck. As Dawn mentioned, we are at the bottom of voter engagement, and she actually has some really good slides too about the ease of vote, and I actually just used that in my prior. I did a webinar prior to this one, and I talked about that. So I feel like it's important that we recognize that, because we can look at these numbers and feel really sad about where we are compared to other states. But the fact is that in 1996, Tennessee was one of the easiest states to vote in, and by 2016 we became one of the hardest states to vote in. So and that correlated with our decline in turnout and registration. So I will just say that, the policies that Madeline talked about and that Dawn talked about, those matter when it comes to civic engagement. And we have groups like both of those that are really fighting to, find opportunities for us to expand democracy in Tennessee. But until then, we've got to work within the system that we have. And that means, helping our friends and neighbors vote and helping them get past those barriers. So if you've got to take a neighbor to the poll, I know it's COVID, but, potentially mask up and roll your windows down. And if you feel comfortable doing that, I know everybody doesn't. But I know rides to the polls have been a really key piece to getting folks to turn out to vote. And I know in a year like this year, that might be difficult for people to want to participate in. I don't think that Davidson County needs any more poll workers, but I think there are other counties that need them. So if folks in other counties that, have the potential to be a poll worker, I think they're still accepting. Dawn, are they still accepting applications for that in other counties?
I think so. You're right. Davidson County is full, but I'm not sure about all the others.
So there might be a potential for you to be a poll worker for you're not in Davidson County, but if you have friends in Rutherford County or any other counties across the state, they might still need folks to do that. Particularly once we open on election day, when there are a lot more polls open, we definitely will need workers to be able to staff those polls. So there's lots of ways that you can get engaged, even if it's just hollering out to your neighbor and making sure that they voted.
Thank you, everyone. What we're going to do in a minute, I'm going to put all three of you on the spot and ask you to give us your 30-second elevator speech that you give to people about why they should vote. But before we do that, I know that there was at least one question, so I want to open it up. And if people have questions or comments they want to make sure we do that too.
This is Van. I had a question actually I have two questions, one for Dawn and then the other one for whoever might want to answer it. I was looking, reading your chart, and so under eligible voters in the presidential election, the number in some cases was lower than the voter turnout number. And so I know I'm missing something that's really obvious, but I couldn't figure it out. So if eligible represents the pool, what was the other?
So you're saying, so this column is the estimated percentage of eligible voters that are white or black in a given year. So in 2008, 80.7% of voters were white, and of eligible voters were white, and 15.1% of eligible voters were Black. But in the actual voter turnout, 81% of votes cast were cast by white Tennesseans.
Oh, okay.
60.2%
All right.
were cast.
Okay, that's what it is. Okay, all right.
And again, these are estimates for and self-reported both, self-reported racial data and self-reported voter participation. So this came from the U.S. Census survey. So it's not, it's just, I always want to put the caveat out there that they're estimates on both, but that's why we took the average over the 10 years to show that it's sort of a consistent trend.
Okay, all right. And then could someone speak to voter fraud in Tennessee and what it's like, if there's any of it?
So I can just speak to the voter fraud in general. So, you know, this voter fraud has been studied like ad nauseum. Like there's so many studies out there about voter fraud, and every study comes back that voter fraud is almost never happens. Like the statistical, you know, when you look at the statistics, the percentage of like voter fraud that is found is way less than 1%. So, you know, this idea of voter fraud is really a manufactured narrative. That's just facts. Okay. Like, you know, research has over time and time again have said that, you know, voter fraud is not a widespread thing. Clearly there are incidents that happen just like there are with anything. But when it comes to actually widespread voter fraud, there's no research or any, you know, that indicates that is actually true, that there's widespread voter fraud. So, you know, I think in general, that is just the case. So Tennessee would fall within, you know, what generally happens, which is very small percentage of voter fraud, and particularly intentional voter fraud, right? So, you know, I think that is just something we've heard a lot about, and that's a narrative that continues to play out. And so that's why I always try to make sure that I, you know, just share facts about that, because, you know, I think people continue to say that this is a thing that is a problem, and there's just no evidence that that's true. So, you know, Madeline, you know, Don, do you have?
I was going to say, you're exactly right, Mattia. We've had over the years, and Marion Ott, who's the president of the League of Women Voters of Tennessee, has had to handle this. And there'll be some complaint, and the league investigates it, and there's no fraud. You know, it just doesn't happen. And I think that there are so many fail-safes built into the system that it doesn't happen. It's not like, you know, you can go from one precinct to another, especially now that we have computers. It just doesn't happen. So I agree. It's just a narrative that I guess makes people feel good. I don't know. I did want to also mention very quickly, I forgot to tell you that the absentee vote request is still out there available. And if any of you know of anyone who is afraid of voting in person, go to the Davidson County Election Commission and request an absentee ballot tonight. They're open. If you go to the website, they're open all the time. And then you will get your ballot in the mail, and follow the directions specifically. Don't just gloss over it. Don't be one of these people who doesn't read the directions. And then if you're concerned about mailing it at your own local neighborhood post office, go down to Broad at the Frisk Center. There's a post office underneath the Frisk Center. That is where the post office box of the Davidson County Election Commission is. Put a stamp on that envelope, put it in the slot, or you can even, if you want to, go in and have it postmarked, and they'll turn around and drop it in the PO box for the Davidson County Election Commission. So you get a sense of it will happen. Your vote is there. And then you can go to, I will put that in the chat box as well. You can go to the Tennessee Secretary of State office and give it a couple of days, and then you will see ballot received. And then you know it's there. And then once it's counted, you can go back there and say ballot was counted or whatever the phrase they use. So we are transparent in many ways in Davidson County about that.
This isn't exactly a question, it's an observation. I helped somebody register to vote the other day, and I thought, well, okay, we'll just do it online. This person was in my house anyway, and I thought, well, I'll just help with this. And I had the option to download a form that you could send in to your election commission or fill out the registration online. If you fill it out online, it's very difficult. They ask for a lot of information. You have to remember where you might have, the address of the place where you could have been registered to vote before, your driver's license number, and the mail-in piece, which you printed out and you folded it in three and put a stamp on it and sent it on. It had like 3 questions on it. 3 things you had to fill in. There was such a big difference between the 2 systems. And I would think it would deter people, because I had a really hard time extracting all the information we needed to get her registered online. It still needed to go to the election commission in her county, and she had to wait to get her card in the mail to be registered. So to me, this is a huge barrier. I mean, I wouldn't try to do it with anybody else, probably. I would say just mail it in. Anyway, any thoughts on that, or have you had any feedback on that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. I wasn't aware of the difference, or that extreme of a difference in the form that you can print.
I'm fine and check it out. It is, yeah.
Okay, but I will take a look at that because I'm curious. But I think your point about the online voter registration, I've heard that before. It is a lot of questions. You do need to have a driver's license in order to use the online portal because it connects to the Department of Safety records. I think, in theory, the questions are meant to mirror the paper version of the voter registration form. And the question about where you last registered is on the paper form as well, but it's not a required field. Right. And so I think there's a lot of challenges with voter registration. That's sort of one of them. One that we're also looking at is how, when you go to the Department of Safety to get your driver's license and you opt at that moment to register to vote, right now it's sort of it's a paper-based process where you fill out the form and it stays with the Department of Safety until about once a week. They do it more closer to the deadline for voter registration, but in a regular month, once a week, the Election Commission is coming over to the Department of Safety and picking up the stack of paper voter registration forms, taking it back to the office and manually inputting them to process, or they're mailing it or FedExing it to them once a week. So other states, again, looking to other states, have that system where they're able to send it electronically to each other. And so it eliminates that delay and it eliminates the sort of manual entry opportunity for typos and mistakes. And so that's one thing that we're looking at. And one thing that we know the Department of Safety is interested in for taking steps to move towards that direction too. So there's hopefully opportunities to kind of address those.
I would say there's a great opportunity for advocacy there, because I was appalled.
Yeah.
By how difficult it was.
Yeah, I got
a card in the mail. So.
Yeah, I was working with the First Center before COVID hit. They were hoping to they were doing a couple of installations around voting, and they wanted to incorporate voter registration into those exhibits. And so I kind of talked with them about doing, voting registration kiosk. And then when we went through the form, we realized how hard it was and how long it was, and it would probably be something that no one would want to just casually fill out at the First Center after watching it start. And so that was kind of my first indication, and that it is a little more difficult than the paper form, which makes a difference when you're doing voter registration drives and you're trying to drive people to do electronic registration. Yeah, that is a
yeah. I would heartily recommend you just do the paper route from what I experienced. And I don't think it sounds like it wouldn't take any longer if it just once a week the stuff goes out from. Well, that's the voter registration with your license. Never mind. Just reporting the news. That's all.
Any other questions or comments this evening? Then I'm going to go ahead and wrap up with the last question, which is, what's your 30-second elevator speech to get people to go out and vote?
I'll kick it off. I don't know that I can even have 30 seconds worth, but I think, part of what motivates me is we just celebrated the 100th year anniversary of women's suffrage. And I think that is something that resonates more so this year, but it's something that's always in my mind ever since I turned 18 and was able to do it, is that it wasn't always a given for women or for African Americans or for anybody, for people. And it was something that had to be argued for and fought for. And so because of that, it carries this weight with me that if I don't do it, I feel like I'm letting down past generations. So that is an underlying motivator for me. And then also, I moved here from DC, like I mentioned, and DC doesn't have senators and they don't have a voice at the federal level, the national level. So it's a privilege in a sense, having lived there, I didn't realize it, to have representation. And now that I know that and realize that, I want to make my voice heard and I want to have that power, and that's how you get it, is through the voting booth. And so that's what I tell people. Maybe I took 30 seconds.
Thank you. 27 seconds, that's good. Madeline, Mattia?
The way that I look at voting, there are decisions that are going to be made, that are being made about your life, right? Whether, when you drive down the street and you stop at a stop sign, when you go into a grocery store, when you purchase something, when you make all the decisions, a lot of the decisions you just make in your everyday life, there's somebody that's elected that is either making a decision about that, influencing that in some way. And so in order for you to have your voice heard, and in order for you to be able to participate in democracy and even in your communities, you have to vote. I don't want people making decisions about me without me having any input. And essentially, when you're not voting, people are making decisions about your life, and I mean everyday life, and you're not putting any input in that. And so that is really why, I vote. And I think that's why I encourage people to vote, is because these decisions are going to be made whether or not you vote. Don't you want to have a say in how they go? So.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, and building on that, Mattia, I think that's a great point. We have more voters that turn out for the presidential elections. But the most important in our everyday life is our local elections. And we've had some pretty poor turnout just in Nashville in the last few years. But that's what impacts us. It's what gives us our safety, our fire protection. It's what gives us our sidewalks. So it's important that you're heard. It's not necessarily important that you understand all the issues, but it is important that you're part of the process of creating our representative democracy. And the only way you can do that is by showing up. And just as we say, marching is not enough, voting is not enough. You show up afterwards and work to make our union more perfect.
Thank you. Dawn, Madeline, Mattia, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We appreciate your participation in this conversation. And thanks to everyone for participating. Let me just remind you that next week we'll be back to focus on preserving our neighborhoods. Our topic will be Eastwood Roots, the power of storytelling in preserving your neighborhood's history. Our guests will be members of the Eastwood Neighborhood Association. And I've included the link to register for the next session in the chat box for everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We appreciate your time, and we hope you have a good evening, and keep your passion for your neighborhood strong. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.